you began by agreeing quite a bit with each other, and then tended, you particularly, Richard, to some disagreement. Before I stoke that disagreement, I'd like to make sure we do agree on three very simple things. That is, that the three of us all believe in truth, namely, that there is such a thing as objective truth, and it's not just an ideological construct to keep the lower classes down, or whatever postmodernists say. Secondly, that we all believe in logic. That is, that we think that if two statements flatly contradict each other, they can't both be true. And thirdly, that we all believe in science, that we think it is one of the greatest of human achievements, and that we all owe the scientists of many generations a great debt of gratitude for the way in which they have improved the world. Is there any dissent to that, or qualification?
No. Good. So my topic today will be about the logic of religion. That is, how is it possible to think logically or reasonably about religion? What is logic? Logic is sometimes said to be the science of reasoning. That is the way by which we understand how we reason correctly to know that which is true. But I won't say very much about this because it sort of stands in the background. I'll say very briefly that logic emerges in many places of the world, both in Greece, in India, and China, in antiquity, and it had been devised as a way of calculating whether the arguments we're making can be shown to be true according to their form of reasoning alone. So there's a distinction between formal logic, which is the logic of the form of an argument, that is, how the sentences are constructed and how the premises are arrayed in order to deduce a necessary conclusion, and material logic or semantics, by which we distinguish the meaning of words. This will be important because formal logic is indifferent to its ground. It doesn't depend upon what words we use to talk about it. So for instance, if you make an argument like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, you can interchange that with anyone's name. It doesn't have to just be about Socrates, and it'll still be a valid argument. So the question is, how is logic related to theology? And also, what are the theological questions we can raise about logic? And how does this feature in the debate between theists and atheists? That is, on the one hand, people who believe in God, and on the other hand, people who disbelieve in the existence of God. So, you may remember these fabulous debates, which were very prominent in the 2000s and the 2010s. There's a lot of people have wondered about why these debates were so popular, and I have a theory about it. I believe that the reason for their popularity was that they represented a contest about post-secular society. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the history of Western civilization, you can see that, for instance, in the time of Charlemagne, that the emperor was crowned by the Pope, and ever afterwards there was a sort of holy anointing of the kings. There's a close alliance between altar and throne, political power and religious authority. However, after the French Revolution, this authority was toppled. During the time of Napoleon, the middle classes assumed the preeminence in secular society, and there was no longer any deference to religious authority. By the time of the 1960s, there's what people describe as an accelerated secularization of modern society, whereby no longer do we refer to God of public life. Religion is excised from public schools, people call into question religious education, and church attendance throughout the Western world drops considerably. However, after the 1980s and increasingly at the turn of the millennium, we've seen a revival of religious enthusiasm in public life. And this is represented, I think, most especially by two moments. One was the 9/11, September 11th terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center, which ruptured the idea that there would be a perpetual progress of capital liberal modernity, represented by the Twin Towers coming crashing down. On the other hand, by a response, both by the American government, but also in a way that was suffused with religious rhetoric in the person of George W. Bush, which represented a kind of evangelical Christian response to fundamentalist terrorist attacks. Now, in the midst of this, the new atheists wanted to voice their objection that we shouldn't base our public policy and our convictions about political life on beliefs in God or in Old Testament and Stone Age religious beliefs. They wanted to say that we have a more scientific, rational basis for deciding on what we ought to believe and how we ought to use those beliefs in order to influence our decisions in the public sphere. So I take it that the debates are not so much really about the existence of God, although of course they are presented as such, but rather about what it means to answer these questions today. How does God affect our lives, and how does it affect our purposes in the world? So, the new atheists, they're sometimes celebrated like the Beatles, like a band. They say they're four horsemen. You have on the one hand the scientist, Richard Dawkins, the polemicist, the journalist, Christopher Hitchens, the neuroscientist, Sam Harris, and the great philosopher Daniel Dennett. And of course, people have their favorites, and you can listen to their music independently, or you can see them speaking in concert together. And they were well publicized. They traveled around university lecture circuits, on television networks. We probably saw them as some of the most pronounced public figures of the 2000s. I think their stars considerably waned, both with sadly the death of Christopher Hitchens, what seems like the ostracization of Richard Dawkins, both from sort of polite society as well as from the atheist circles that he formerly was welcomed in, and also, I think, also by the torrent of criticism that they've received from Christian apologists and generally people in secular society who've grown distasteful of what they see as a counter-fundamentalism to religious fundamentalism. With that being said, I think that they do raise very interesting questions about how we speak about and how we come to know about the claims of theology. And specifically what I want to address is not simply the first order question about whether there is or is not a God, whether God exists or not. That question, I think, is, first of all, a matter of personal conviction. And secondly, I don't believe any series of arguments would ever be sufficient to persuade you of that. I take the arguments to be neither indubitable nor indefeasible. Because I think that in each case, we can raise questions about how we begin to make those arguments, as well as what the arguments mean. There's a quote by Søren Kierkegaard in the Unscientific Postscripts, where he says that to argue someone into belief in God is like torturing them in order to sort of affirm their love for someone else. It's not possible. We shouldn't even try. So I think we should look at these arguments less as a way of compulsion, as a weapon against our enemies, but rather as an invitation to the possibility of belief. That's what I hope to explore with you today. So, my question for you all is, how is logic related to theology? And there's a lot to be said about this, and I suppose I've written an enormous sort of book about it right now. I can say a lot more, but I'll make it very, very simple by outlining what I think are 4 possibilities. And I've outlined here below. On the one hand, we can say that logic is grounded in God, which we call theological logic. We can say that logic is not grounded in God. Sorry, I should say not. Atheological logic. Theism is logical theology, and theism is theological. Now, for most of the history of classical theism, which begins arguably with Parmenides and Plato, beginning with Philo and the Alexandrian Church Fathers, up until Thomas Aquinas, Maimonides, and Avicenna, we hold roughly to these positions. On the one hand, that God is the creator, not only the visible world of things that we can observe in the material realm, but also of the pure forms of thought. So God is the creator both of the visible and the invisible, both of matter and form, both of things that we can observe and the things that we think about. Augustine says that God has already counted out all the numbers in advance, so that every time we count them, we only count them again. And this means then that logic, as pure forms of argument, are also created by God. God, as it were, the creator, the ultimate metaphysical ground of all of the ideas of logic. For this reason, we can say that it's possible to come to know God through the way that God has already, as it were, thought out and create the forms by which we come to know God. Our thinking is a way of coming to know God, thinking in our thinking. The eye by which we know God is the eye by which God knows us. That's called, we call this logical theology. This is going to be a bit contested later on because of criticisms about possibly using modern logic to talk about theology, but I'll leave it at that. The second position is one that developed in the Middle Ages. You might be surprised to learn that modern atheism can be traced to scholastic controversies about the possibility of knowing God through logic and grammar. This tradition grows up from a question about whether God is constrained or not by the laws of logic. So if God could not create a paradox, if God could not create a stone that God could not lift, does that mean that the law of non-contradiction is prior to and constrains God's liberty? So one of the opinions that was floated in the Middle Ages, specifically by Henry of Ghent, later Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham, was that God did not create the laws of logic, but rather was constrained in some way by him. And this position you can call atheological logic. Roughly speaking, it's a way of thinking about logic as though it's something that stands outside of divine creation, or something that is within the world but that God does not have complete control over. We can also call this secular logic, by which we talk about logic as though it has no explicit relation to God. It's a pure form of thought, like mathematics or playing chess, that God doesn't have any role in. Something that we do but doesn't have any divine influence. And one of the consequences of this is it's then possible to talk about a logical atheology, or a logical atheism, by which we use logic to criticize the very belief in the existence of God. So one thing you might find very peculiar or mystifying is that there doesn't seem to be atheists in antiquity. There seem to be people who are skeptics of religion, but no one says that God doesn't exist. So for instance, even Epicureans say that they don't deny the existence of God, as though sometimes they're opponents say, but rather they say that the gods are rarefied beings who have no control over our lives. So the reason why there are no atheists in antiquity, arguably, is because no one had yet formulated the position precisely enough, either as to what the essence of God and the existence of God meant, or also how it's possible to deny it. That's something that happens in the Christian Middle Ages, and it's for that very reason that atheism and secularism become possible in the modern era. Okay. So, I want to address different ways of thinking philosophically about theism and atheism. And the reason I want to do this is I want to, as it were, elevate our conversation above the standard limits that you find between atheists and theists in these kind of controversies. I don't just want to argue whether God exists, but I want to argue about how we argue. That is, I want to assess the very form by which we can think reasonably about these two positions. So I want to distinguish between naive and philosophical theism. Typically, when people talk about belief in God, they talk about it as a personal conviction. That is, I have a belief, it's my choice of faith, it's my personal connection. And as edifying as pious as that may be, it doesn't yet tell us why we're justified in believing it, or what grounds we have for understanding that to be true. Philosophical theism is a tradition that grows up from antiquity, beginning with Parmenides and Plato, continuing through the Neoplatonists and the Arabic and Latin scholasticism, and attempts to give justified arguments for why it is that we can hold these beliefs to be true. It doesn't just affirm that they're true, but tries to argue that they must be true according to the form of reasoning that we come to know them. So, what are the arguments for the existence of God? If you look at the history of philosophy, you can find, I think, three types of arguments for God's existence. And although there's innumerable kinds of arguments, and you can find in popular books something like 100 arguments for God, most of these can be sort of analyzed down, condensed down to three major kinds, which I'll be summarizing for you very, very briefly. The first is the ontological argument, from the word ontos logia, for being, or the structure of being. And I'm going to summarize these as quickly as possible. If God is that of which nothing greater can be thought, then for any idea of God that does not exist, this idea is not God, and God must necessarily exist. One thing to know about this argument is that it's an argument from reason alone. It doesn't appeal to any observation we have of the effects of the material world. This is sometimes described as an a priori argument, which is states prior to any material sensation. The second two arguments are a posteriori arguments. That is, they appeal to our observations about the world so that we discover the trace of divine action present in the world. And these are the cosmological and teleological argument. And cosmological comes from cosmos logia, refers to the speech we give of the universe, the cosmos. And then teleological comes from teleos logia, from the speech we give of the perfection of the purpose of things in the universe. Now, these two arguments I want to argue are actually the same argument, but reversed. So one is from the first cause, one is for the final cause. So the first cosmological says that if for every effect there is a prior cause, there cannot be an infinite regress of causes, then there necessarily must be a God who is the absolute first cause of all effects. And the teleological argument says, if for every cause there must be a final purpose, there cannot be an infinite regress of purposes, then there must be an absolute final purpose of all causes. Now, I deliberately framed these in juxtaposition so you can see the difference. Can you see the difference here? It's right here. One is talking about the first cause, and the other talking about the final purpose. In each case, we're talking about causes, but one cause that comes before, as we typically think of causes in terms of efficient impact, and the other cause that comes as the final end, that is that for which I'm acting. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics says that all action is done for some reason, just like any archer shoots towards one goal. So, people have often been baffled by these arguments. There's so many of them, we don't know how to assess them. We can't possibly go through hundreds of arguments. Most people don't care. And it has very little impact on how anyone comes to believe in God. Arguably, it's irrelevant as well, because ultimately, belief is sustained by faith, conviction, and desire, and not merely by intellectual rationalization. That being said, I believe these arguments can actually be analyzed into a single argument. So this is the master argument for God's existence. And if you're ever talking to someone about this, I hope you'll carry this with you. It's a perfect way of sort of concluding the debate. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher who lived at the age of the Enlightenment, wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, often considered to be the culminating figure of European rationalism, as well as the founder of Romanticism, argued in one of his early essays that all of the arguments could be analyzed into and reduced to the ontological argument, the first argument that I mentioned. Now, how does this work? Yes, so how does this work? So the way this works is that the first and final cause that I mentioned were juxtaposed and reversed in the cosmological and teleological argument are always already about the the most perfect being, or about the idea of God, but there is nothing greater that can be thought. So in each case, what we're talking about is how it is possible to analyze from the effects or the consequences of observable matter and thought in the created world to the first principle from which they can be thought to be, or that is the first mover or the final purpose which they are created. So essentially all of them are attempts to think back or forward from that which we observe in the world, to the idea of God as that of which nothing greater can be thought, to the absolute idea, most perfect being that gives meaning to everything else, either as its cause or as its purpose. The ontological argument is thus the foremost of the arguments for the existence of God, and also, I believe, the underlying logical belief that people hold when they claim to believe in God, when they announce that they have a belief and a relation to God. However, I want to point out very quickly that there are many different kinds of ontological arguments, arguably as many as there are religions. This is where it becomes very, very complicated. So, most people will say that the ontological argument begins with Anselm of Canterbury. He was a great English theologian who was Archbishop of Canterbury, the predecessor of Rowan Williams, who you just saw. He made this argument in a book called Monologium in the 11th century. And it's a very brilliant argument. This one's a bit more complicated than the one I showed you previously, but essentially it argues just the same, that if God is that which nothing greater can be thought, then for anything that we think that does not exist, it could not be God. So God could not be thought to not exist. Therefore, God must necessarily exist. There's a few more versions of this argument. One comes in a critique that Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel made against our friend Immanuel Kant. He wrote a very brief series of lectures they delivered in Berlin in 1831 called Lectures on the Existence of God. It's just recently been published into English if you're interested in it. In it, he critiques Immanuel Kant's critique of the ontological argument in the Critique of Pure Reason, and arguably his entire philosophical system in an attempt to rehabilitate the ontological argument within a logical framework. I won't be able to go into too many details about that, but you can ask me afterwards. The last is the foremost and most exciting edition of the 20th century, Kurt Gödel. Now, Kurt Gödel was had a very, very sad but exciting life. He discovered in, I think, the age of 21, two incompleteness theorems that subverted David Hilbert's ambition to devise an axiomatic foundation of modern mathematical logic. So he completely upended the entire program of mathematical logic in the 20th century. Due to persecution in Vienna, he later moved to the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, where he had many fun outings with Albert Einstein. But at his death, which was very, very tragic, he left us a number of papers, one of which was this argument that he had outlined in modal logic. And while I won't go through all the details with you, I will just point out that it is possible to formulate this argument in more and more precise terms using the tools of mathematical logic. And it's a contemporary topic of debate between not only mathematical logicians, but also philosophers of logic. So, what are the objections to this argument? The reason why you might say philosophers today don't universally accept this argument is because of a long-standing objection that it is a circular argument. So you might have suspected something strange about this argument. There's something strange about this argument is it seems to suggest that the very idea of God shows that God is necessary. How could that be? Surely if we had an idea of God, we all thought about God, we would all know that God is necessary, but of course people disagree about it. So there's an objection raised by a monk named Guanilla of Marmontieres in the time of Anselm. He argued that to say that God is the greatest idea that can be thought, and that God could not be anything other than to not exist, is just like saying that there is a perfect island that is the greatest of all possible islands. And that perfect island could not be thought to not exist because then it would not be a perfect island. Anselm responded to this argument, and I don't think it's the best counter-argument, but I'll tell you what he said. He argued that an island is not like God. And the reason why an island can't be like God is because however great an island can be imagined, there can always be an equally great but different island. So suppose you had an island that had like chocolate fountains bubbling up from the sea. That would be a really cool island. But if you had an island that had orange juice, it would be just as cool but different. God is different than all of this because God is the ground of all goodness. God is the perfection of the good, of truth and beauty, and so on. And God is also perfectly simple, so there can be nothing different within God. And for this very reason, we can't imagine anything better than God, because any such imagining would equally be God and nothing otherwise. Okay, the other point of the argument is that it seems to suggest that when we say that for any idea that is not God, that is not adequate to our idea of God, such that it could not be the God that is necessary. What we're doing is we're including in the first premise of the argument the premise that holds that God is that of which nothing greater can be thought, the virtual consequence or the virtual operation that annuls the second premise. That is, it annuls any alternative to that idea of which God is the greatest. To say it simply, if we say at the outset that God is that of which nothing greater can be thought, that very sentence tells us that for any alternative where we say that God does not exist, that idea cannot be true. If we falsify the alternative, falsify the contrary, that God cannot exist, then we're also simply reaffirming the first premise, namely that God exists. So to say that this consequence does not actually follow in a deductive way, but rather it follows merely by the repetition, the virtual repetition of the consequences of the first premise. This is what philosophers call circular argument. The reason why it's considered not a good argument or a fallacious argument is because it's not considered to tell us anything new about the consequence, about the conclusion. Rather, it simply tells us what the first premise states. So it's not simply saying that there is a God, in a sense. That is, we affirm God and therefore we conclude that there is a God. Now, there's another interesting consequence of this which I wish to explore with you. If we can say that God is that of which nothing greater can be thought, and that very statement or that concept can be unpacked analytically to annul its consequence in and for itself, to reaffirm its absolute necessity from its pure concept. This statement, this argument, can also be reversed to develop a counter-argument, which is to say that God is that of which something greater can be thought, and therefore there is something greater than God, and therefore God does not exist. So I'm going to explore this with you. This is something that has been briefly suggested by a British idealist who I'll mention later, but we can describe these as two different kinds of ontological arguments. One as a positive ontological argument, in which the argument proves positively that God exists, or well, that God positively exists. And the other as a negative ontological argument, in which the argument proves that God does not exist. Now the reason I mention this is because I would find it very, very boring to go with all of the arguments for God or all of the arguments against God. Also, I don't just want to I would find it equally boring if we were simply to rehearse all the reasons why we agree or disagree, or why we don't consider these arguments valid. Rather, I want to find what I think is the best argument, both for God's existence and against God's existence, as a way of bringing the conflict to its pure conceptual framework. Okay. So, what is philosophical atheism? Typically, atheism is framed in just the way that theism is framed. People either say they believe or they disbelieve. They either believe that there is a God if they don't believe that there is a God. It's merely a matter of personal conviction. Again, like philosophical theism, I would say that there is not just a volitional sense in which we say we believe in God, but there's also a rational sense by which we say that we have good reasons to believe it, and we can analyze the judgment of belief or disbelief in God to the reasons for which we can hold that judgment to be true. So we can call this philosophical atheism. And I mentioned previously that there are hardly any atheists in the history of philosophy. This might surprise many of you because most people today think that all philosophers are atheists. However, there is a long tradition of critiques of philosophical theism in the history of philosophy. I wrote my dissertation on Origin of Alexandria. One of the critics of Christianity was Celsus, who was a Middle Platonist philosopher, who I believe wrote the first critique of Christianity, followed by Porphyry, another great Neoplatonist philosopher. And so in these, we have great philosophers writing critiques of Christianity, and of course there are people writing critiques of religion immemorially and up to the present day. So I want to trace this legacy, but also to suggest that unlike theism, that affirms something, atheism, in denying that, denies it in infinitely many ways. So if you think about this like a tree, if you want to build a tree, you have to plant a seed, you have to grow it up over time, and you have to be consistent with what came before you. So to be a reasonable religious believer, you have to respond to the tradition of that religious belief, testament, and practices. However, if we were to criticize something, you can criticize it in infinitely many ways. You can say that it's wrong for any number of reasons. And for that reason, there can be any number of different alternatives, any number of different atheisms that are contrary to theism. This makes atheism a bit of a difficult thing to grasp, because unlike theism, it doesn't have any coherent essence. It doesn't have any tree trunk. Rather, it sort of springs up a bit like moths, sort of attacking at the bark at every direction. So what are the kinds of atheism? We can look at this historically or conceptually. I want to boil this down to what I think are three different logical moments of the development of atheism. I'm deriving this from a book recently written by Christopher Walken, who's Difficult Atheism. So I want to say that, first of all, the earliest naive form of atheism we can call imitative atheism. Imitative atheism, as we saw previously, wants to affirm that there is a truth, whether it be of science or reason or logic, that stands apart from theology. And rather Rather, it holds that there is a basis for both criticism and disbelief in theology that stands apart from it. You all remember when we watched the opening clip with Richard Dawkins and Rowan Williams? They both agree that there is objective truth. Now, that's really astonishing to me. I mean, from a Christian perspective, and Rowan is a good friend of mine, so I'll say this. I know from personal experience, from a Christian perspective, it's quite plausible to say that there is objective truth. And the reason for this is that in the gospel, Jesus says, I am the truth and the way. And the early church fathers would say that aletheia, truth, is a divine attribute that existed eternally in God's essence. So you can say that just as truth is a property of God, truth is also objective. But how can you say that as an atheist? What would the truth be for an atheist? There's a famous line in the Gospel of John when Pontius Pilate confronts Jesus and asks Jesus, what is truth? Or what is truth? We can say something like it's the best model of scientific reasoning, or it's the totality of all logical inferences. But what holds that together? What makes it one and the same? In The Gay Science, Friedrich Nietzsche famously said that the death of God would wipe away the horizon of truth. So how is it possible to speak about truth as an atheist? I would suggest that typically what happens is that atheists are imitating theists. That is, when they deny theism, they want to deny one part of it, namely that there is an object of God by which we say God exists. In the case of Bertrand Russell, he said that belief in God is like belief in a teapot hanging in the void between Mars and Jupiter. And we can neither know nor not know that there is such a teapot, but it doesn't matter to us. And moreover, not knowing it doesn't give us any better basis for believing it. But of course, what's wrong with this metaphor is that belief in God is not like belief in a teapot. God is not merely one material object hanging in the void. Rather, God will be the ground and purpose of everything that exists, and also the necessary reason for everything that exists. So the difference between affirming God or affirming the existence of a teapot is the difference between affirming the principle and ground of creation itself, and the difference between affirming the ground and the existence of a finite material object. So imitative atheism typically assumes that there is an objective truth, that there's a standard of logical reasoning, that we can come to know it through scientific practices, and it does so in ways that assumes a kind of absolute background, but also a basis in reason, goodness, and truth that it otherwise finds very difficult to account for. And there's many different theories of truth that we can go into, but the challenge behind them, I believe, is that they are very much grounded. They're very much ungrounded. They rely upon certain assumptions that we take for granted, for which we have no ultimate reason for believing in them, apart from something like faith. So the second kind of atheism is what we call aesthetic atheism. And I believe that Richard Dawkins actually moves in this direction. So I think that Richard Dawkins, as we saw from the video, is what you might consider an imitative atheist. However, Richard Dawkins is also very interesting in that he's promoted a kind of quasi-religious movement of atheism. Sometimes it's called atheism plus or humanism. He's also sort of established call lines for people to be consulted about their lack of religious belief or their disaffection from it. In a certain sense, he's encouraging a kind of conversion of society to atheism in ways that sort of appear strangely to mimic Christianity. And he's even openly admitted that his moral values are very much informed by his Anglican upbringing, such that it seems like this is a negative version of Christianity. And as I mentioned previously, the very notion of atheism and secularity emerges by a kind of negative subtraction of doctrinal Christian belief, of the belief in universal goodness, truth, and the subtraction of the authority of the church in the late Middle Ages. So this leads to a continual sort of effacement, a continual negation of those beliefs. And in order to sustain the belief, you have to say not only that I believe that there is some basis of reasoning apart from theology by which we can criticize theology, but also that I don't believe that it has any absolute ground apart from human consciousness or from our various social practices. There's continual denial, continual effacement of that ground of belief. This is very similar to the aesthetic movements that grew up in early Christianity. Asceticism, by the way, means withholding of desires. So it refers to how the monks would travel into the desert and they would refrain from indulging in desires so they could purify their souls. Now, one of the dangers with this is that it requires a continual exertion of the will and a continual activity of denying that which you ostensibly believe in. And I suggest that this results in a fundamental logical problem of atheism, which I'll mention very shortly, which is that it requires an infinite negation of the very ground by which you could make such a denial. So in order to deny that God exists, you have to infinitely deny that there is a ground of objective truth by which you come to know that God does not exist. The last form of atheism that I want to recommend is what we might call philosophical atheism. Watkins calls this integrated atheism. And I believe that there is a possibility of radical atheism that can be philosophically defensible, and I hope to explore that with you today. Now, essentially, I think this kind of atheism has to look backwards before philosophical theism to the pre-Socratics facts. This has been attempted by Friedrich Nietzsche and Mark Heidegger, and I believe it's still an ongoing project today in continental French philosophy, specifically with Alain Badiou, John McNancy, and Quentin Meillassoux. The reason why I believe this is more defensible is because I don't believe that it falls into the trap of infinitive and aesthetic atheism, of infinitely denying so as to efface the ground of objective truth that stands opposed to or other than the God that it ostensibly denies. So, what is the logical problem of atheism? In short, I believe the problem is this, that in order to affirm belief in atheism, you have to deny the existence of God. But in order to deny the existence of God, you also have to deny that there is an absolute idea that can be the ground of truth, which would be also the basis for truthfully analyzing, inferring, and coming to know that that judgment, that affirmation that there is no God is true. This might strike many people as surprising because most people assume that atheism is merely a subjective or subjective choice or independent volition by which we affirm from our own will and heart that we disbelieve in something. But if we analyze the conditions for its possibility, if we ask how is it possible to come to know that this belief is true, then we can also recognize that there may be a performative contradiction, a contradiction that arises not simply in the order of premises and inferences, but a contradiction that arises in the conflict of mutual presuppositions that we have in order to come to that judgment. All right, so what would you say is the best possible kind of atheism? Typically in philosophy we say that we should not strawman an argument, we should not say that we're going to reduce it to its weakest form, but rather we should strawman it. We should develop the most powerful form of that argument in order to raise the most incredible objections and also understand the objection most fully. I believe the most powerful kind of atheism is the negative opposite of the ontological argument. So previously, I said that the most compelling argument for belief in God was the ontological argument. Why? Because, as I argued, following Immanuel Kant, all of the other arguments for the existence of God can be analyzed in to the belief in the highest idea that would be both the first cause and the final purpose for which everything else can be analyzed. That is, following the arguments, if both the effects can be analyzed in the causes and all events can be analyzed in the purposes, and the first cause prior to all effects is both eternal, just as the final purpose, that is after all effects, both the beginning of time and the end of time, the beginning and end of all things is equally eternal. And what we're talking about in all of these arguments is the same idea, namely the idea of the highest idea that can be thought, of which nothing less can be thought, that must necessarily exist. So the negative ontological argument is the reversal of this. Rather than saying that God is that of which nothing greater can be thought, we say to the contrary, that God is that of which something greater can be thought. Now, how is this possible? It's quite difficult with God to disprove God. And the reason for this is that, unlike, for instance, a material object, like a teapot between Jupiter and Mars, for which hypothetically, if you were to condense all the space between Jupiter and Mars, you could discover that there is no teapot. Just like, for instance, if you were to try to disprove the Loch Ness Monster, if you look to Loch Ness and you drained the lake and you found there was no dinosaur inside the lake, you would know that there is no Loch Ness Monster, right? God cannot be disproved that way because God cannot be found anywhere in the material universe. By definition, God is the creator of space and time, and for that reason, absolutely prior to anything that can be found in space and time. That means we can't disprove God merely by observation or the disconfirmation of any other observation. Rather, the only way to disprove God is to show that the very idea of God is a logical contradiction. What does that mean? So, in logic, if two premises are have contradictory statements, if one says that Ryan Haecker is in Cambridge, the other says that Ryan Haecker is in Oxford, and Oxford and Cambridge are not in the same place, then neither one can be true if the other is false, and vice versa. So I cannot be both here in Cambridge and in Oxford simultaneously. Similarly, there are logically impossible thoughts. So most thoughts, for instance, like suppose you could imagine that I'm in Oxford giving this lecture rather than in Cambridge, but there are other thoughts that can't be imagined. Try to think, for instance, of a square circle. Can you think of a square that's both a circle and a circle that's both a square? Can't. The reason why is because the very form of the circle excludes the possibility that it's equally a square. Now, we can also make statements that can be analyzed into contradictions, however they're analyzed. So if I said that this statement is a lie, I'm saying that this statement is false. And if I say that this statement is false, I'm both affirming it to be true and stating it to be false simultaneously. Now, if you say that that statement is true, then it has to be said to be false. But if you say that it's false, it has to be said to be true. So however you analyze that statement, it results in a contradiction. Now, something similar can be done with God. If you imagine that the idea of God is self-contradictory, then there could be no God that is both one and the same at the same time. Now, there's a few obvious reasons why I might say that God is self-contradictory. Going back to classical theism, God is said to be both simple and absolute, both the beginning of all things as well as the creator of all things that virtually contains all complexity. So God is both absolutely simple and absolutely complex simultaneously. That seems like a contradiction. In Christianity, God is both one God, one divine essence, and three divine persons, both one and many, or both one and not one. Also in Christianity, God is both absolutely prior to the world, but also equally immanent in the world. God is the maker of the world as well as made within the world, as Jesus is born of Mary in Bethlehem. And there are many other things you can say. However, in each of these cases, it's equally possible to conceive of an alternative form of logic in which those contradictions don't obtain, or which those contradictions are not as troubling. So that's what I want to explore with you now. So I was going to say it's possible to make a counter-argument to the ontological argument, the argument from reason, from the highest idea, that shows that this idea could not be thought. Okay. So I'll proceed through this very quickly because I didn't put it in the slide. But for every idea that we have of God that is incoherent, that is not a coherent idea of God that can withstand analysis, that's valid and consistent, that wouldn't be an idea that we can entertain and believe and worship. There could equally be an idea of God that is coherent. What I want to say is that just like in modern mathematical logic, if you assume certain axioms, some of those axioms can result in a contradiction in your form of logic or your form of mathematics. However, in recognizing that there is such a contradiction, that we find that we cannot think of the consequence, we can equally think back to the founding assumption of that very form of logic in mathematics. We can introduce new assumptions, new axioms, and we can think of it in a different way. So similarly, in geometry, in art, in religion, we can not only assume certain starting assumptions about the role of reason in theology, but we can also analyze those, criticize them, find where they prove to be contradictory, and in virtue of finding them to be contradictory, work backwards from the beginning, look at the entire system of theology from the beginning, and reinvent it, rethink how it began and what its consequences may be. This, I think, is what we can call not simply a first-order deductive inference from the axioms linearly through the conclusions, but rather a dialectical circle by which, in recognizing the contradictions that emerge from our founding assumptions about the role of logic in theology, we can then analyze those assumptions, criticize them, and reconceive them in a way that creates a more robust vision of an alternative. Now, I believe that this can also be done of the ontological argument and also the ways we come to know the ontological argument. That is, we can not only assume an idea of God, that of which something greater can be thought, but also, in saying that something greater can be thought, we tacitly suggest that there is an idea that is greater than the idea of God we previously had. And if you continue this infinitely, you proceed from the lesser idea of God to the greater idea of God, from lesser validity, coherency, and cogency, less compelling belief, to a more compelling and believable God. And if you look at the history of philosophy from the time of Parmenides and Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, Philo, Clement, Origen, and so forth, we see this continual dialectic working itself out, both in the history of philosophy as well in religious traditions. And I believe it continues to carry on to this day. So we have two different kinds of arguments. One is a positive ontological argument, whereby we argue that God is that of which something greater can be thought. And the other is a negative ontological argument, which we argue that there is something greater, of which something greater than God. And this results in a conflict of two different lines of argument, each of which are I suggested, the best forms of argument for and against God, but for which, even if we accept a negative ontological argument, we show by this argument that there is an idea that is greater than the idea of God that we formerly held. And if we continue that onward, we find that there is an idea that is continually greater, such that if we carry on to infinity, we should suggest or expect that there is an idea of God that would satisfy all of our expectations and doubts for belief. This can be called, following Jay and Finlay, who I showed you previously, rational mysticism. And arguably, the origins of mysticism, of initiation into the mysteries, is an attempt to understand the forms of reasoning by which we grasp that which is true and absolute. That is an attempt to proceed through the succession of the ideas that we have about the world that give meaning and explain the world to a more totalizing conception. When we find, for instance, that the idea that we hold about the world satisfies our intellect and longing to know what is true about it, and also what we desire. So, at the end of this argument, we pass from the question of whether God exists, or the existence of God, to the question of what is the idea of God that would satisfy our intellect and desire? What is the idea of God that would be greater than all of the ideas that came before, all of the ideas that were less than the highest idea that we can think of? That as we pass from the question of whether there is such and such a thing that we can call God, as to what we would say that idea of God is. This, I believe, is also marks the passage from philosophy of religion, or the sort of basic question of whether there is such an object that we can talk about, to the question of how we should begin to talk about it, and what it means for our society. And in short, this is a passage from philosophy to theology, that is, from the most general questioning about all of the arts and sciences and their basic presuppositions, including the presuppositions of such an object, to the question about whether that object, whether that idea has communicated and been received in the history of humanity such that we can respond to it in a way that's consistent with that tradition. With that being said, I want to also conclude by suggesting that, in contrast to philosophy, theology is paradoxically more open to the possibility of atheism. And this might strike you as very surprising, because we assume that most philosophers are atheists, most scientists are atheists. But there's a certain sense in which there's, as Dawkins, I think, hopefully exploded, there's also a polite reserve in speaking about the possibility of the existence of God or the disbelief in God. In a certain sense, Dawkins has been sort of exiled from polite society because he broke the taboo of talking about religion. Theologians have as their vocation to talk about religion, and for that very reason can raise the most radical questions of whether the object of their discourse, namely God, exists. This reason, I believe, that theology uniquely welcomes the possibility and the exploration into the consequences of atheism today. So, what are we to make about the new atheists? What has happened to them? You might have noticed that there aren't many of these debates today. In a certain sense, I think people's appetite for them has waned. A bit like how people's appetite for some kinds of violent sports wane over time. Once we've seen the bloody boxing matches too many times, we give up on the spectacle. We know what's going to happen. I think the reason they've waned also is that people no longer think that the question needs to be settled on a public stage. People have come to the conviction that it's their own personal belief that matters, but it's also the networks of belief and the networks of activities that they can grow over time with their neighbors, their friends and families that really matter the most. So if we want to change the world, don't stand on YouTube and shout about it. Rather, maybe volunteer at your local soup kitchen or take care of your grandmother. So, what does that mean about the role of logic in theology? As I mentioned, my research in the Faculty of Divinity for these past 5 years has been related to this very question of the role of theology of logic. In short, I will say that if theology can only be credible in as far as it is responsive to and can answer to the question of the arts and sciences, most of all of philosophy, that asks the most general questions of all sciences, then theology must be attentive to the questions of logic. Theology must be able to answer to the question of what is logic, what is it for? For this purpose, I have recommended a Theology of Logic, which is a theological interpretation of the fundamental forms, ground, and purposes of logic in our society that analyzes not only the rhetoric, but also the pure forms of logic themselves in order to situate them within a rhetorical arena and theater for the purpose of showing how belief could be credible. Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll have questions now for the next 15 minutes. Go ahead.
Yes, so a really amazing depth you've gone into here with the argumentation, but I have a question about the lineage of Christian philosophers, which you kind of inserted here and there. Specifically, we know that by the time of Aquinas, there was obviously a concept of arguing for the existence of God. And in my own limited reading of the Christian philosophical tradition, which has been in a much earlier era, it seems that started out with using logic to argue against things like heresy. And I would love to know where the idea of using that argumentation just about God's existence rather than targeting specific heresies or heathenism or whatever, where that came from, and I guess what figures were involved in that.
So I think that there's three, thank you for your question, I think there's three moments in this development. First of all, logic had first been developed by Aristotle in Athens in the mid-4th century, and it was originally devised, as he argues, as a way of distinguishing between valid arguments and invalid arguments, or philosophical and sophistical arguments. And it extended generally to every possible argument. So it wasn't restricted simply to arguing about religious faith. Although Aristotle, if you're interested, argues for an intellectual conception of God in Metaphysics Lambda, where he describes God as the thought that thinks itself, that is moving all things by thinking all things, and thinking all things by thinking of them in the most perfect way, which is the way of the syllogism, that is in the way of logic. So Aristotle, in a certain sense, grounds logic in theology and thinks of theology in a logical way. Secondly, the polemics against heresy, although I think there's some precedent for this in Greek philosophers, it's not until you have a sort of canon of orthodox belief that you can really talk about the distinction between orthodoxy, which is the what we believe is true, and heresy, which we consider to be inimical or false. And this emerges most precisely in the conflict between early Christian ecclesial authorities and the early Christian Gnostics. So the two sort of foundational works of this are the Against All Heresies by Tertullian and Irenaeus. By the time of Origin of Alexandria, who I have a dissertation on, the development of a systematic compendium by which we can analytically demonstrate Christian doctrine coincides with an attempt also to critically refute the various alternative beliefs that he considers to be unchristian, false, or heretical. And this, I believe, is the sort of underlying sort of logical engine that motivates not only the sort of anathemas that are made against non-Christians or people who fall outside of Orthodox Christianity, but also later against people who don't hold any belief in God at all. However, the question about God's existence doesn't tend to feature in early Christian writers. And I think the reason for this is that they are mostly arguing with people who already believed in God in a robust sense. Origin of Alexandria, for instance, argues with Stoics and Platonists, but he doesn't really argue with Epicureans because he considers them just not worth talking to. So I think that's generally the case. So I mentioned it's very hard to find atheists in antiquity, and most philosophers would be some kind of theist, because regardless of what they said about God, they would think that there was some kind of absolute truth and ground of reality that we can talk reasonably about. Really, the question of atheism emerges among scholastic philosophers in the genre of apologetical literature that is represented, I think, best by Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentilis. And in this work, Aquinas is attempting to not only to show why he thinks Christian belief is reasonable, but also to respond to non-Christians who hold alternative beliefs. That is, he's speaking to the Gentiles. And by speaking to the Gentiles, he cannot assume that they hold any specific conviction about whether God exists. However, as you mentioned, the Five Ways of Thomas Aquinas appears at the beginning of the Summa Theologia. And the reason why it appears there is I believe he thinks that he needs to provide a rational basis for the first question, which is the question of what is God, in the Summa Theologia. So he has to provide a rational basis, and for that reason he rehearses, again for the purposes of students, because this is a summary of theology, why it is that Christian philosophers believe in God. And from there it's taken off in innumerable trajectories. And I believe also that, for reasons I mentioned in the late Middle Ages, that some of the underlying assumptions about the way that the forms of logic are grounded in God as the creator of the ideas of logic comes to be suspended, and also in that suspension and opposition comes to be the basis for many of the subsequent critiques of these very proofs that would be the underlying basis of modern atheism.
Taking the position that even if we could prove logically that God does exist, can we ever prove why God should care about human beings?
That's an excellent question. So one of the questions that often arises in these debates between atheists and theists is, even if you were to prove that God exists, does it matter to us? Would it be an indifferent God? Would it be a God that sort of creates the world and says goodbye to us and never comes back again? I think that the challenge is not just, as I mentioned previously, a philosophical question about the existence of God, but rather about what we say God is, about the essence of God. So it's a question more of theology than of philosophy. Now, that being said, there's a big question in antiquity about whether the God of the philosophers is a person. So suppose that we all were sort of old-fashioned deists, like Thomas Jefferson, and we all believe that there must be a creative universe. Does that mean that God who created us still cares about us, like the Father, like someone in the sky who's looked down upon us, answers our prayers, is concerned with our daily thoughts? Now, I think that is much more difficult to sustain, even if we say that this God in its absoluteness must somehow be present to us, because a creator is not separated from us in space, but is equally close to us in as far as it's active in the creation of all things, all of our thoughts and feelings. It doesn't mean that God has any feelings like us, that has any kind of sympathy with us. So one of the arguments is that a God like this couldn't really sympathize with us, because that God wouldn't share in human frailties or emotion. So if the God was completely perfect, fully good, and had no need of us, then it wouldn't have any pathos, it wouldn't have any suffering. And if it didn't have great suffering, it couldn't have great sorrow and great love and great sympathy and understanding of our suffering. Now, I also think that different religious traditions have different understandings of this. I spoke to a group of rabbis a few months ago, and this was one of the issues that came up. Can the gods of the Old Testament really care about us if that God is so beyond us, is a sort of cloud of fire and sort of turns cities to salt? And I suggested to them that Christianity is unique in that it says that God is not just beyond the world, but has come into the world, has become a baby even, so that it can suffer and die just like us. And it's on the cross, as it were, that we recognize that such a God could endure the utmost human frailty, that is, to die in agonizing torment. So I think that shows us in that image that God could sympathize with us, even sympathize with a condemned person executed to die. And I think that's a bit more hopeful than the classical deist picture.
Thank you. Can I rather build on that question and your response and start by going back to the very beginning of your lecture, where you gave us the clip of the Dawkins-Williams debate, and the chair spelling out its definition of logic as something where if two things were not compatible, they couldn't both be true. Now, you've talked a lot about theism and atheism, and most within the Western tradition, theism tends to accept, let's call it an interventionist deity, and leaves the non-interventionist deity to the term deism. So if one has theism, and most people who say they believe in God, believe that this supreme being can in some way intervene in this life. And yet most people simultaneously believe in the power of personal choice, personal commitment, etc. So, intellectually, divine sovereignty, human responsibility, which are logically incompatible. And yet, many believers of different religions accept the two. And I would strongly suspect that in some way, Rowan Williams would accept both of them. Now, that would lead to a different definition of logic than the one that framed the very beginning of that debate. And that I think is underlain a lot of your presentation. So could you try and unpack that a bit more?
If I understand correctly, the fundamental contradiction you're drawing out is between the sovereignty of God, who in creating and sustaining the world determined every effect as a consequence of that divine creation,
and ongoing in terms of human life.
So the conflict between what you might call divine determinism and free will for human liberty. Yeah, so this is a huge problem. I've often thought of Rowan Williams as a sort of modern-day Augusta Hippo, and part of the reason for this is that he was a bishop sort of reluctantly, and he also had to speak to the challenges of a sort of the fall of an empire. In this case, I suppose it would be like the empire of sort of Western modernity. But in any case, Augustine and Hippo wrestled with this very question way back in the 5th century. And the challenge of it is, it seems like, just sort of working back, there's different ways in which we say that events are determined, that they must be so. So, for instance, we can say that if everything in the universe, of course, according to a kind of clockwork mechanistic necessity, such that for any effect, there must be a sufficient cause, and that cause is mechanically operative, such that the effect follows directly from the cause. And we trace that chain of causation all the way back to the Big Bang. We said that everything that happened in between then was sort of followed of mechanical necessity. Then we say that there could not be anything otherwise than what happened. Everything would be determined, it would necessarily be so. And this notion had been developed by the ancient Stoics in antiquity, that there was a soul of the universe and everything operated according to the laws of logic, and that there must be a necessary cause for every effect. such that everything is already determined in advance. So the Stoics were in a way the first determinists. They held a view that was represented again by Spinoza in the modern era, and it tends to be the most favored view by philosophers today, which is called compatibilism, which says that determinism, however you think about it, you can think about it in terms of natural determinism, that the universe follows orderly laws of causation, mechanical causation, cause and effect that lead to every effect being determined, or you can say divine determinism, by which God, in causing all things, creating all things, and foreknowing all of them, foreknows and determines that they should be just that way. So the conflict is, how can we say that everything follows the necessity and that we have the choice to do otherwise? Because to say that we have freedom is to say that we could have chosen differently from the way that we had chosen or the way we will choose. I think that this possibility of difference, contingency, and alternative possibilities are already present in the divine essence of God. And that the reason why humans have the possibility for human freedom is because they share in the image and likeness of a God that already contains that contingency or that alternative possibility within God's self. This is an argument that Augustine of Hippo had made as well. He said that the image of God within us, that is the way our likeness to God, also shows that we have the likeness to a creator who, of his own charity, had created the world in such a way that he need not to have created it, but created it with the possibility of freedom within it. And one of the reasons why, just briefly, there's one of the standard arguments for free will is that without free will, we would not have responsibility. We could not say we're responsible for having done something because we could not have the mobilized. We equally would not have a purpose for our moral agency. We would not have any purpose for our practical choice about why to do one thing rather than another. This is also a theological question because if you hold the belief that everything is determined in advance, then it means that not only we are, as it were, exculpated from all of our crimes, but then all of our crimes are ultimately given to the creator, to the agent and principle that determines everything in advance. So we're not culpable for everything, but God is culpable for everything, and that's not a God that we could believe in. Okay, going back to the central question, which was about how is it possible to reconcile these two notions. I think that there's a difference between the very simplified notion of a logical contradiction between a statement that says one thing and another that was framed by the moderator, and the notion that logic I recommended in this debate, or this lecture. And the difference is between what you might characterize as finite classical logic that developed with Aristotle and continues to be taught as a sort of foremost kind of logic today, especially in modern mathematical logic, and what you might characterize as dialectical logic. So you might have noticed that in my debate I recommended a history of philosophers of logic or philosophers, beginning with Plato. In Plato's dialogues, he recommends an alternative way of reasoning, which he characterizes as dialectic. That is, of making arguments and moving between those arguments in order to advance from the aporia or the unexpected consequences that we can't believe in to a more credible belief that we can. Dialectic, I think, can admit for a dynamic virtual possibility of contingent alternation that is present in all things and for which we can make choices about the world that could be otherwise. That is, we can say not just that things happen according to a strict logical consequence, but also that within the very concept of things themselves, there is a possibility that they could be otherwise, and also that we could choose otherwise to bring them about. And we can talk about it afterwards if you like. Okay.
I just wanted to ask, the kind of philosophy you've been talking about, what's the similarities or the differences between the kind of logic you're talking about and the kind of logic that runs a computer?
Brilliant question. I'm writing a paper about this now. Okay, so computers operate essentially on binary code transcribed across circuit gates according to Boolean algebra. And what that means is that if you were to, you've probably seen this done before, you can boil down all advanced computer programming to binary code that can be constructed through various digital combinations into various codes that then program the operation of the machines. Essentially, computers are really exciting for this reason, that they are engines of calculation and they automate logic for us. They're ways of thinking without human minds thinking them. Now, the Boolean algebra is essentially reducible to let me think about this. So Boolean algebra assumes certain things about logic that are not assumed in a more general perspective. So there's an infinitely many different kinds of logic, and just like there's an infinite many different kinds of mathematics that can be formulated, and these different forms of logic and mathematics have different axioms, but also different conceptions as to what they are and how they operate might be. Now, one of the assumptions of algebra is that there's a symbolic representation of possible enumerations and calculations, but also that there's a transitivity or mutual interchange of terms. So for instance, if you calculate sort of 2a plus 2b and so on, you can exchange the variables in various consequences. Now, this wouldn't be possible if you thought that the concepts were different depending on their ground and purpose. So for instance, suppose we think about Boolean algebra. We try to sort of imagine how a computer works, or we try to think about binary code. The way that our brain works is not founded upon mechanical processes. I mean, this is something we can argue about, but it moves according to neurosynapses that have organic relations. And because of that, the way that we think is not sort of reducible or primarily according to discrete terms or to the transitivity relations. We have to do quite a lot of work in our brains to come to an abstract form of algebra and mathematical logic that can calculate like a computer can. Whereas a computer does it natively because of its mechanical design. That being said, I don't believe that computers are sort of inscrutable to the human intellect. I think that because we designed them, we also can know how they operate. And hypothetically, we could think through anything that a computer can think through and vice versa. However, I don't think a computer has the same liberty that humans have because it doesn't choose its original design or program. It has to operate according to the way it's manufactured, as also to, if it's a more specific computer program, according to its original programming language and purposes. Well, we're coming to an end today. Is there any last questions, or shall we conclude? One last question.
Can I just pick up on this question which has been raised between free will
Yes.
and God's interference, if we put it like that? That from my perspective, there seems plenty of evidence that a loving God interfering in our everyday life would not, we would not have a world that we have today. I mean, you only have to turn on your television set to see babies being slaughtered, etc., etc. So that seems to be out of the question. I also had a conversation some years ago with a Muslim imam about the Muslim belief in predestination, and he said that, well, everything you do in your life is already decided, predestined by Allah. And I said, well, what's the point of it all? And his answer, which is quite clever, I think, was, well, Allah knows what's coming for you, but you don't. So you have a free will, but it is Allah's will. There are parallels, of course, with all the monotheistic religions. But I was also thinking of the Big Bang, which you mentioned, and where scientists, atheists probably come to a bit of a stop is, yes, but how do we get to the situation where the Big Bang could occur? What happened before the Big Bang? And there, of course, we're going no further back, before time. Similarly, I think theists have a problem with, yes, God has existed and created everything, but who created God, or what circumstance created God? It seems to me you could match those two things. I think there is a religion that believes that God existed and created the universe, and then stepped back and said, right, get on with it. So in that sense, God does not exist now. He or it or she existed to create the universe. Now that would satisfy both the scientists, atheists. It's an explanation of where the Big Bang ingredients came from. It may not satisfy all theists to say that, well, God existed, but in a sense no longer does.
Brilliant series of questions.
Just a thought.
Well, so I think there's about 4 or 5 questions here. I'll try to go through them as quickly as I can. So the question about So the question that atheists often raise, you find them often framed by Richard Dawkins in these debates, is if God is said to be the creator of all things, what created God? Now, this I think is misses the point and also is a relevant objection, because in classical theism, God is said to be a se. This is described as divine aseity, which is God exists of his own, of God's self. God doesn't exist because of anything other than God. So if God is the highest idea of that which can be God, then there is nothing higher than God that can be the creator of God. Similarly, if you say that God is absolute, there can be nothing other than God that is before God. Also, there's a very famous phrase, I think it's in Augustine's Confession, where it says that if anyone asks you what God was doing before the creation of the world, tell them that he was making hell for whoever asks stupid questions. And it's funny, but it points to the fact that it is a stupid question in a certain sense, because if God created all space and time, and there is no time before time. There's no time before God created time, such that there could be nothing before God that God depends upon.
But that's the argument that could be used before the Big Bang.
Sure.
That there was nothing before light existed.
Yeah.
There was nothing.
Right, so let's go to the Big Bang then. The question of the Big Bang is like the question I mentioned with the cosmological argument, very nicely framed by William Blake's image here of the eternity of days. So if everything can be if all the expansion of the physical universe, all space and time, can be traced back to a singularity from which that expansion began, then we can ask the question of where did that singularity come from? And of course, physical cosmologists give many answers to this. Some of them say that there's many alternative universes, parallel universes. Some of them say that there is a loop between the Big Bang and the Big Crunch. Some of them say that there's maybe an infinity of universe, maybe it's turtles all the way down. However, I believe the fundamental question is not so much a question of physics, but of logic. So as I said previously, the cosmological argument is not just a question about tracing the effects of motion back to the cause, or the first mover that is unmoved and equally moves everything else, but it's also a question about logical consequence, that is tracing the consequences of any chain of reasoning back to the first condition, or the unconditional, that is the condition for everything else. So what we're asking is not so much about whether there is a singularity that comes before. In a certain sense, physicists can't really know that because it escapes any physical observation or any hypothesis about what we can learn in physical observations. Rather, it's a question about where our thought moves, where we go in thought when we look back from what we know to what are the conditions of the possibility of its knowing. And in that sense, I think that we have to account for not only how it started to expand, but why is there anything at all? That is, why is there being rather than nothing? And I don't think that falls within the domain of physics. I think physics absolutely assumes that there is being and there is motion that we can observe. Rather, it's a question, I believe, of metaphysics, that is, of asking the fundamental questions about being in its structural relations, substance, essence, and so forth, but most especially of theology, that is, why it is and for what purpose it has. So I think that we gradually ascend in our thought back to a question which we can answer in different ways about whether there could be a God that could be the creator that is expressed and shown to us in the expansion of this universe that we hypothesized in the Big Bang. The last question was about evil, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
Is God continuing? Did God just stop at the creation?
Yes.
Or does
Okay.
he continue? I mean, my friend over there was saying the same thing.
Right.
To
So
what extent does he interfere in our daily lives? And
yes.
the
So-
evidence
so-
seems to be that he doesn't very
So
much.
most of these arguments are only about the idea of God, not about whether God is active upon the world. So even if, suppose you were to accept the arguments for God's existence, you wouldn't know for that reason whether God acts. It's a bit like saying that you know you must have parents, but you don't know who they are, and you don't know if they love you, or if they don't know if they send you presents for Christmas. It's at least hypothetically possible. How we know about whether God acts in the world, we'll have to look at the history of the world. We have to look to how humans have responded to this question in the past. I think myths are actually quite telling in this one, because in oldest traditions across the world, people talk about the gods and God and ways in which they respond to divine powers. It's quite ubiquitous, but it's also hugely formative for our tradition. Most of our language is shaped by our myths. We wouldn't be able to, as it were, think with the categories and grammar of our culture without referring back to myths and revelation. So I think that in order to answer this question about, as it were, what is the role of God in the story of humanity, we have to look to the stories we've already told. And I think for that reason also to look to the central stories of our culture, namely biblical tradition and the tradition of sacred scripture that have come down to us from various different sources throughout the world. On the last question of evil, I'll say this very briefly because I know it's a pressing topic and it will keep us long into the day in a very despairing thought. I know that there's more pronounced evil in the world today than we've perhaps ever seen in our lifetimes. However, I don't think that this should lead us to despair. Rather, I hope that you will also see in it a glimmer of the possibility of human freedom to rectify the misdeeds of the past. Augustine's fundamental argument against the problem of evil was that it is greater for us to have the liberty to choose to do wrong than to not have that liberty at all. So when we observe a conflict between what appears to be the misuse of human liberty, the cruelty that we inflict upon another, we also recognize the possibility of countering that and finding the possibility of being better for ourselves. And I hope that we'll see that in our present day. Thank you.